All right, greetings everyone. My name is Maren Brisson-Kuster. I am your current president of NC Realtors. I hail from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I actually am sitting here right now in my office. I wanted to let you guys know that this session is being recorded. So don't type anything you wouldn't want anyone to see, but also just know to pass that on to everyone. More importantly, it's so everyone, all of our members have access to this that could not sign on and participate today. So it will be posted later this evening on NC Realtors. We have over 700 people attending this session right now, so I call that a success, and I love having you all engaged. If you have any technology problems whatsoever, please reach out to the tech hotline. That number will be posted in your chat box, and it should probably be there now. I'm going to guess Rachel's already posted it for us. We're also going to try to answer a few questions at the end of our session if we have time. So keep that in mind and make sure to type in your questions, and staff will get them to me so we can get Bryan to answer them. So our speaker today, number one, is just timely and a wonderful guy and someone I think you're going to really learn from. Bryan Greene is the head of Fair Housing Policy for NAR. It is honestly a privilege to have him here, and it's really just good timing to have someone here today. He's going to give us the scoop on NAR's new Fair Housing Plan and how everything anywhere in the realm of fair housing is going with NAR, legislatively, with the federal government, regulatory issues, you name it. Bryan's got his hands in it, and he's going to pass on some of that firsthand knowledge to us. So I think this is a powerful session for us today. Make sure to take notes and save the link when it comes out, because I think this is something that I am going to encourage every one of you to share with your coworkers in your offices if they're not logged on to see this. Please make sure to check out Bryan's full bio on NAR's website. That's really it. I'm going to go ahead and get to the meat and potatoes of our meeting, and I'm going to have Bryan cue up his screen and his audio and kick us off. With that, thanks for joining us, Bryan, and I'm going to turn it on over to you.
Thank you, Maren, and it's great to be here. North Carolina is my ancestral home. My father comes from North Carolina, and used to go down there a bit to visit my grandmother and other family. I think many people have been talking about what we're going through right now in the country as an awakening of sorts. And I would say for the realtors, that awakening began a while ago. We earlier this year launched what we called ACT, Fair Housing Action Plan. And that really was, in many respects, a direct response to more attention on discrimination that still occurs in the real estate marketplace. I was hired in November, and within a few weeks of my hire, there was a big story up in New York Newsday, where they did testing on videotape of the major companies out on Long Island, and found that minorities were facing some form of discrimination 40% of the time, African Americans were facing discrimination 49% of the time, Hispanics 39% of the time, Asians, I want to say 19% of the time, and we recognized there was a lot more to be done. And I think for many people, it was an awakening in part because it was all videotaped, and they actually saw how people of different backgrounds were treated. And so, for all of us who see ourselves as the guardian of the American dream, this was really a wake-up call. And so ACT came out of that. No doubt right now, our nation's going through a second awakening, which has been occasioned by the killing of George Floyd, where more and more Americans are recognizing that we have problems of systemic racism through a lot of our institutions. It's a term that's perhaps difficult for many to understand, but I think bottom line is we recognize that despite our best efforts, outcomes for different groups are often different. And so that's something also that among realtors, we're looking at what can we do to make sure that we aren't contributing to problems, and that's not just transactionally, but globally. So that's sort of how I want to frame this. I want to talk a little bit about what we are doing in terms of our Fair Housing Action Plan, and then talk about what comes next. So I want to pause for a second. I think we're still connected, right? I'm looking at Marin still frozen on the screen, but can someone just confirm for me?
We are.
Good.
Right,
okay.
we're good. I will let you know if you are not.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't hear you if I were talking into the void. So I just wanted to be sure before I start checking to see if you're calling me on my phone or something. So just to start, we have an awareness challenge. I was just talking to a realtor in another state, and Louisiana, and we were talking about assistance animals, and these cases come up. This one was in property management, and we were talking about assistance animals cases. And I was saying, at HUD, when I left HUD, 60% of the cases we were getting involved disability and some form of reasonable accommodation. I want to say a full third of the cases involved assistance animals, the cases that people were filing. Then I said, it's been interesting coming to NAR. I've been at NAR for 7 months. And, while I get the occasional assistance animal question, it's not most of what I hear. And she was surprised. And I said, yeah, mostly I'm dealing with allegations of race discrimination and what can we do to address these issues. And she said, does that still go on? And that surprised me. And she quickly corrected herself and said, well, yeah, I'm sure it does. But it surprised me that we even asked that question in light of, say, this New York Newsday story, which was pretty widely circulated. It was a national story. While it started in New York Newsday, all the major newspapers and media actually covered it. And if you saw that, even if you want to dispute, some cases as discrimination, there were a lot of tests and lots of differences in treatment. So you would think, coming from that, you would recognize there's still a problem. We've done some surveys of our membership to ask folks, what do they see? We did a survey in January. That survey asked whether members had witnessed discrimination or experienced it themselves, and a very small percentage said that they witnessed or experienced it themselves, like maybe 8% in that survey. 33%, I want to say, 59% said they had not seen it at all. It just said no in response to the question. And then another 33% said no, they hadn't seen it, but they believe it exists. And that's sort of a surprising finding to me, in part because people were given the option to say no or no, but I believe it exists. And only a third of all realtors said that they believe it exists, in addition to the 8% who said they had seen it. So overwhelming, well, not overwhelming, but a majority, about 60% of realtors don't acknowledge that it exists. And we did another survey just now, which some of you may have received, which is called the Community Equality Survey. And that was occasioned by recent events in our country, and we wanted to ask a broad range of questions. But we asked this question too, again, about discrimination. And the results were slightly different, but not dramatically different. This time, about 12% said that they had witnessed discrimination in the real estate business, and 49% simply said no, and 38% said no, but I believe it happens. So that percentage going up from 33 to 38, maybe based on what we've been up to for 6 months at NAR, made a difference. Maybe the national discussion about these issues made a difference, but still, we're only talking about 5 percentage point difference in acknowledging a problem, which if we're doing our job and if we're sharing the information that we have and see, you would expect to be higher. So, so we have an awareness problem, and there's a lot that we're trying to do to address that. And in fact, we even asked this question on this most recent survey if people were aware of NAR's work in this area. And a great number of people were aware of it. What was fascinating to me was the general population of our membership were about 75% were aware. African Americans in our membership were less aware. So to the extent that we're trying to address the problem and talking about it, there are discrepancies in who's even aware that we are tackling it. So however you look at it, it means we need to do more. Let me just point out one other thing too. I heard this on NPR, since everyone's talking about policing. There was a survey looking at the views of white officers versus black officers in terms of whether we've achieved equality in the country. And 90% of white officers said that they believe we've achieved racial equality in the United States. And for African Americans, it was something like 27%. So folks on the same police force on this question about our society, a chasm, almost 60 percentage points, believing in terms of whether we've achieved fairness in our society. And likewise, when asked the question about the protests we're seeing nationwide, 27% of white officers said they did not, 27% of white officers said they believed the people protesting were genuinely concerned with racial justice versus 70% of African American officers who believed the people protesting were genuinely concerned with racial justice. Again, another huge chasm of like 40+ percentage points. So we've got this huge chasm, and regardless of what your belief is, you know, if that question were directed to you, it should force you to ask, well, why do we have such divergent views about this based on our racial background? And, you know, I think one significant reason is because Americans still live apart, largely based on race, that we're still not even living in the same neighborhoods often in our metro areas, not attending the same schools. We're very, very much apart. And that is something as community leaders, as people who sell people houses, rent people houses, we should be concerned with. And we should be investigating why this still exists in our society and what can we as leaders do about it. We're 1.4 million members. So one thing, of course, is make sure that in our transactions, we are upholding the law. And I'll explain how this is necessary but not sufficient. Of course, we cannot violate the law. We need to make sure that we're complying with the law. Let me talk a little bit about what we're doing in that respect. And that's where this ACT plan comes. So soon after I arrived, New York Newsday story, I had my own plans about things that we needed to do, but I needed to act fast because people wanted to know, well, you know, you've got these damning findings out on Long Island. What are you all doing? And when I reviewed the investigation there and, you know, brought to it, you know, my background of working in fair housing enforcement at HUD, I thought, well, okay, some people are saying this demonstrates that we need to do more training. And I thought, well, yes, but training doesn't seem to be why this still happens in 2019, now we're in 2020. We need to make sure we have top-notch training. But again, training is necessary but not sufficient. The video that Newsday put out on their website showing the differences in treatment, it showed people saying things that indicated they had training. They were using words like steering and saying, I'm not supposed to steer, or as an agent, you know, I'm not supposed to discuss schools. Or so people had gotten lots of training, but they hadn't necessarily embraced the training. They still believed for some other reason they needed to discriminate or share this kind of information that they've been trained not to share. And so there's a cultural challenge too. So that was the other thought. Training, great, but not enough. We also need cultural discussion and cultural embrace of 51, now 52 years of the Fair Housing Act and our code of ethics. But then finally, whether you believe it or not, you've got to be held accountable. And there are laws. There is a code of ethics. And it's possible that people who are still engaged in these practices don't expect to be held accountable. We need to make sure at the end of the day, folks are held accountable. And I ranked them in that order. And that's literally how we came up with ACT, where A is accountability, C is culture change, and T is training. And the leadership team invested resources in different activities that. So I was talking about ACT, and I was saying training, that implicit bias training we recognize as one of the critical trainings that we need to provide now. And many of our membership were emphasizing that, just learning the law and just learning, being instructed on the law and just, the basics of scenarios, it was not enough. That people had to recognize how biases we bring to transactions can influence what we do. And implicit bias training uses mind science to help teach how this occurs. And there are leaders in this. In fact, everyone's talking about police departments. Police departments throughout the country do this. Courtrooms are doing this. Hospitals, all kinds of industry. And we committed ourselves to bring top-notch implicit bias training to the realtors. And so in the first step to do that, we posted online about 10 days ago a 50-minute video introducing our membership to implicit bias training. And many of you in your state and local associations, I know, have done this, but we wanted to do this organization-wide. And we launched that. And it's a 50-minute video. We're aware that people are home in many states, and this is an opportunity for people to get this kind of training, while they are quarantined or in place, and proceed at their own pace. So that's the implicit bias training that's on NAR.Realtor right now. We intend to do a 3-hour training for brokers, building off that brokers can then use to train their agents. So to go greater in depth, more examples, scenarios directly relevant to real estate transaction. So that's a big step. In addition to that, we are doing what we're calling gamification training. The same company that put together Commitment to Excellence for us are going to put together a training module, an online training module that really puts you in sort of virtual scenarios. And so they have a way of using gaming technology to present you with scenarios where you are the realtor or where you are the consumer, and there are different situations you navigate. And so rather than just, again, speak to you about the law and regulations, you actually apply it to scenarios and examine your tendencies and the like. So that's something that's already in process. We're hoping to actually have that completely launched by our annual meeting in November. So very, very excited about that. And there's other training, but those are really the two signature acts we're taking. Culture change. There's a lot we need to do. When the New York Newsday story broke, I said to myself, well, one of the things I'm noting is that they tested 12 companies. They said there were findings against 10. They did a lot of tests two of the companies, despite the many tests they did, they didn't have findings against. And I said, well, you know, we need to highlight those companies that are doing things right, and we need to talk to them and hold up, you know, what practices they have in place so that their agents are not ensnared in this. And so we're working on a video with a fair housing organization in New York, actually one of the premier fair housing organizations in the country, and a filmmaker that they have used for a number of movies to highlight the leaders, and you know, not only why do they follow the law, but how following the law also makes them prosperous prosperous realtors and leaders in their communities. Because that's the other thing too, is like, you know, the Long Island situation, they're all in the same market. And if there's a financial incentive people think they're serving by engaging in discrimination or something else, they've got peers who are equally successful in that market who are following the law. So that's one thing we're doing. Schools keeps coming up, you know, whether it's in this Newsday video or in other situations. You know, generally realtors are advised don't talk about schools, and so instead realtors direct people to third-party information. But I think we all know that, you know, our schools are segregated, and schools perpetuate the same residential segregation we have in society. And a lot of the various third-party resources just focus on test scores, which are also just very highly correlated with income. And not everyone goes to the best schools in the United States. I mean, we have a wide range of schools, and a wide range of schools that have different features that are attractive to different people. And so we're looking at how do we peel back this onion and help provide consumers with more variegated information about schools, more accurate information about school quality. And this might involve engaging some of these third-party companies to see whether there's better information they can provide. Well, I was just running down ACT and talked about, you know, doing some work around fair housing in schools. So that's our, that's really going into a new area, but an area that's necessary. And we have to sort of figure out, you know, how do these issues reinforce each other, and how can we make sure we're part of the solution and not problem. So, and then let me turn to accountability, which at the end of the day is really critical if we're going to ensure that people are following the law. As realtors, we want to be held accountable, and we want to make sure that the laws are strong in fair housing, and that you know, when there are people in the profession, just like any profession, who don't follow the norms of the profession, that there's some consequence. And so in that regard, we are making sure that we have strong state licensing laws that address fair housing, and that we have tools to determine if within companies there are issues that need to be addressed. So self-testing is a tool we want to make available to companies. So a company that wants to know, you know, if its agents are treating people the same regardless of background, they can do these self-tests, get background, and self-correct. And so that's a major item of ACT, to create this self-testing program that would allow companies to do this. In terms of the state licensing laws, the goal would be to review state licensing laws, identify what are the strongest elements of these laws, and to work with association executives to see if state laws where they are can be strengthened. You know, are there minimum expectations we have for these laws, and for each state to sort of work to ensure that their laws are the strongest that they can be. So on that final one, we've got a law firm we've been working with to review the different laws, what works, you know, what are our must-haves, and we'll begin a process to talk with different association executives Many feel very confident their laws are great. Others, recognize that there can be improvements and want ideas. So that we see as a role we can play there. But at the end of the day, honestly, even with the strongest state laws, you may still have issues because people who experience discrimination don't report discrimination. And one of the reasons they don't report discrimination is they often aren't aware of it. So, for example, on the face of it, you might think that New York has a very strong anti-discrimination law and strong requirements when it comes to licensing. But what the New York Newsday investigation showed us is that even in New York, the consumers aren't aware of the differences in treatment. And, in that Newsday investigation, they actually only believed they were treated differently when Newsday brought the white tester and the Hispanic tester, or the white tester and the black tester together. And so people aren't going to report discrimination with the strongest laws in the world if there isn't that, knowledge of how they might be treated. And that's on us as professionals to make sure we aren't treating people differently. So that's very important work. We support the government and the work the government's doing to address housing discrimination. It's never really been well funded to address it. We've supported bills to increase the funding for testing because we want to be held accountable, and testing is one of the best tools to do that. So let me just say, in terms of government work, the government has been doing some interesting things too. HUD just recently worked with Google to make sure that that interface is not creating opportunities for people to discriminate. Google has a function, or has had a function, where you could prefer zip codes or exclude people by zip codes in housing transactions, and we know how that can discriminate. So Google has said that they're going to take away this functionality, I think starting into this year. So Google worked with HUD to figure out ways in which it can improve its platform. And this is comparable to some of the work that Facebook did. And Facebook, also began addressing these issues as a result of HUD and private fair housing groups getting involved. And I was actually at HUD when we started that work. So, so that's progress there. And then finally, we as the realtors, are leaders, and we should recognize that it's really critical to our society that we be on the vanguard of issues. You all know that the Realtors prohibited in its code of ethics discrimination against persons based on sexual orientation in 2010, and then gender identity in 2013. We still have no federal law that prohibits such discrimination in housing. Yesterday, the Supreme Court, of course, recognized that discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity is covered under the existing employment discrimination law under Title VII. That while Title VII, we all know, prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender, so sexual harassment in the workplace, or unequal pay in the workplace based on your gender, the Supreme Court found that the language of the law and the concept of the law also prohibits discrimination against LGBT persons. So an incredible leap forward for our country. The question remains, will this also ultimately be the legal application in housing? There are lower court cases which have found that sex under the Fair Housing Act also encompasses LGBT discrimination. That has not gone to the Supreme Court, but jurists often look to Title VII, slightly older fair housing law, in its interpretation, slightly older civil rights law in its interpretation of the Fair Housing Act. So I don't think many people are going to want to bring cases to the Supreme Court as now constituted, to challenge whether the Fair Housing Act prohibits LGBT discrimination. The language is not that much different than Title VII. So we'll see. And the question also will be whether, Congress takes action. We have been supporters of the Equality Act, which would amend the Fair Housing Act to explicitly prohibit LGBT discrimination. We'll keep an eye on how HUD and the Department of Justice interpret the Fair Housing Act. But I think it is a harbinger that LGBT discrimination will be prohibited either administratively in HUD complaints or ultimately in the courts. So that's a really, really big move. And then finally, I'll just say, just more broadly, we need to continue to be leaders. We've got 1.4 million members. We're respected as thought leaders. We really have a role in shaping society and our communities. As the nation talks about these current issues around race, we need to, we've been leaders in recognizing our historic role in this area. 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, NAR acknowledged that along with the government, we played a role in the segregated societies that we have today. And there's no doubt that that kind of segregation ultimately, influences neighborhood quality and some of the policing issues that we see today. And so today we want to be part of the solution. We're not just addressing discrimination in transactions. We need to look globally. We always say, in real estate, it's location, location, location. So whether it's schools or, community policing, what have you, they're all, location based. And we as the Realtors need to lead in helping the nation find solutions. Let me just close by sharing a story. As all of these issues around race in the country have come up, internally within the National Association of Realtors, our leadership and the staff found a need to talk about this. And we had a staff meeting, which was originally, I think, slated to be a half hour, maybe went on, or maybe it was even an hour, but went on for like 2.5 hours, where many staff really wanted to talk about their own personal experiences. It says a lot about our association that people wanted to talk with their colleagues and felt comfortable being vulnerable with their colleagues to talk about these issues. One of my colleagues, one of the first people I met, shared his personal story. My name, again, is Bryan Greene. His name is Troy Greene. And I remember when I first started getting emails from him, he's in the press shop. I was like, oh, Troy Greene. I have a twin brother named Troy Greene. So this is like, a name, the forefront of my consciousness. And I'm like, why is my brother writing me at work? And I realized, oh no, this is someone sending me press releases and things. And so for the longest time I hadn't met him. And then finally I met him. While he could be my brother in the sense he's African-American, he's maybe 6'4". My twin brother is taller than me, but not that tall. But he told a story during the staff meeting just about a personal experience he had. There's one more bit of background. Troy Greene is one of our stars. He writes the press releases. In fact, when this whole Long Island thing hit, he was one of the crisis managers on that. He's one of these guys who knows how to deal with crises. And, I've always described him as like the person I want to go to war with, just because he's just that good in managing situations and advocating for the Realtors. So he told this story of how he was looking for a house, and he and his wife and his infant child were in the car, and they drove to a neighborhood where they wanted to buy a house. And they were coming back from church, so they're dressed in church clothes, and they're driving slowly through a neighborhood. It was a predominantly white neighborhood, and he noticed that some of the people walking by, or some of the people out watering their lawn, seemed to be noticing him. And since they were looking at homes, they're driving slowly. And he thought to himself, I wonder if anyone's going to call the police on me. He didn't share that with his wife, didn't want to upset her. It was a beautiful day, didn't want to poison it with that kind of thought or fear. But he thought it. And not 10 minutes after he thought it, sure enough, a police car pulled up behind them, siren. And so a police officer walked up to the car and asked if he knew why he stopped him. And he said, no, I don't. And the police officer said, oh, well, you rolled through that stop sign back there. And Troy knew he had not rolled through a stop sign, but he did not fight with the officer. Instead, he just quickly said, look, man, we're just trying to buy a house. And Troy said, this just really messed him up the whole day. This was all he could think about, just how he was treated in that situation where he was just looking for a home. So he shared that story with us. And, he said it was hard. He didn't he'd never really talked about these things before in his workplace. But he talked about it with his colleagues. And as I said, he's just an admirable guy. He's your advocate. He's a man who speaks up for you. And I just want to encourage you all, as this dialogue continues, to speak up for Troy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bryan. And I hope everyone continues to maintain this dialogue, quite frankly. It's one that's got legs for the first time. So I hope we continue. And on that note, we are going to go through some questions. Now, we have about 20 questions, but some of them are going to blend together. Some of them we may not have time to touch. And if not, I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I promised you would do to this whole group while you were gone. Basically signed your life away. I said any questions that we did not have time to address today with you, that we would send to you and you could help add some color and address them for us.
Yeah.
So I committed you anyway without even knowing. But I'm going to go through some of these questions for you and just let you run with the answers. So the first one, how do we make more affordable housing dollars available to smaller builders that are willing and able to build affordable housing?
Oh, that's a government question. You need us to advocate for you. And I do think that there are opportunities. I'm a fair housing person. I think from a fair housing perspective, there are opportunities to make that case that we are able to provide more housing opportunities in a greater range of communities by doing that. HUD is doing some affordable housing work in the sense that they're trying to reduce the barriers to affordable housing development by promoting greater density and other removal of other restrictions to affordable housing development. So we're engaging with them on that, and I think we just have to keep doing that.
Excellent. All right, next question. And this is a good one. This is one that sadly everyone has run into if you've been showing property for long enough in your career. And I do say sadly because it's unfortunate. I've run into this myself. If clients say something like, I don't want to be in the neighborhood because I saw a lot of blank raced people there, what would be the most appropriate way to respond? Follow-up question was, can we continue to still work with them? But I think the most prudent answer is the first.
Well, I definitely think you tell them, what your job is, and that you do not make any decisions based on those factors. And you may even ask, can we work together? Do you understand? But you certainly make clear that you're always going to follow the law, and that's that.
True story. All right. Third question. Do you think the variance between percent of HUD complaints versus NAR inquiries in regards to disability also speaks to the lack of awareness that realtors have in regards to disability challenges and protections?
So, yes and no. It's interesting because I think there's just two different systems. I mean, HUD, it takes administrative complaints, and so I think that is based on who knows their rights and who's likely to speak up and file a complaint. And people with disabilities, the discrimination people with disabilities face is much more in your face than other forms of discrimination. So I think that's a large part of why those matters go to HUD. I don't know that disability issues aren't being addressed on the ground by realtors. It's just very possible that they're being addressed, directly, and that I'm not hearing that much about them. I do hear some issues, but not as much as I did at HUD. I'm new. Maybe it's not long enough to have heard all of the issues, but it's something I definitely want to continue to monitor and evaluate.
Right, and I touched on this one briefly a little bit, discussing some of the local associations and their education opportunities for assistance programs. But the question was targeted, I'm going to guess federally potentially. It seems that there are numerous programs for assistance with home purchases and low housing income and affordable housing. Where is that money going? How much has been used, etc.?
Well, I'm curious. I'm not an affordable housing person. That's definitely one of these questions where I can research with my colleagues and get that back. Affordable housing no doubt has an intersection with fair housing, but I'm principally focused on compliance with the fair housing laws.
Well, and I think that that's a good intersection, quite frankly, for you to think about as well, to ruminate on. I think that's a great intersection for our side of the industry and our advocacy side, i.e. y'all, to come together, because I think that that's really an avenue that we have to grow in and help consumers and our neighbors.
No doubt. Right. And coming out of COVID, that we're gonna, we're just gonna see all of these issues nested together.
Absolutely. All right, another question, and this is really more local, but I'd love if you could add at least a little flavor to this, if you will. Is it true the city councils vote on what affordable looks like in certain areas? And what are specific requirements, if any, for those specific areas to be considered to develop these housing projects? And I know that those are very specific to the local jurisdictions.
Say that again.
The question was, is it true the city councils vote, local city councils clearly, vote on what affordable looks like in certain areas? And what are the specific requirements, if any, for those specific areas to consider developing these housing projects? So I understand that a lot of that comes from local.
Yeah.
But is there anything that you can add from the federal view, the high level from fair housing, on how this plays out?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest issue is, what kind of leadership, say, can the federal government provide with respect to zoning? When I left HUD, this was a big initiative, and I actually was helping lead this initiative to, look at affordable housing barriers in communities and to really be sort of a clearinghouse for what works and what can be done. And an investigation of what purse strings that the federal government have to influence, decision making. Obviously, many communities rely on federal funding, and so federal government continues to look at, how it can carrots and sticks to promote more affordable housing development. There are many cities and states who are, getting rid of single-family zoning. Because that, in many communities, ends up being, one of the biggest drivers of limited housing opportunity and higher housing costs. Others are looking at, other solutions, but there's a range of potential barriers there, and NAR is engaged in that conversation with the federal government. I think Megan Booth has been leading a lot of that there's an opportunity for state associations to make themselves heard too.
Well, absolutely there is. I agree with you. All right, so this is one that I am interested in your take on this, because this is an active conversation we're having right now in our forums committee. And the question was directed to NC Realtors. What can we do to eliminate the language in the offer to purchase concerning down payment assistance? And so to give you a little background on that, this language was added more than a year ago to the lending section on our offer to purchase. And it's all about perspective. It was added as a finance disclosure, just like FHA, VA, right? But that is not public perception. So the perception is it's another way to weed out buyers who may be minorities or first-time home buyers. So I would actually love for you to have your perspective on that section being on the offer to purchase.
Okay, well, I can't say I've investigated it, but just based on the description, I think it's important to evaluate whether something that's neutral is having an effect on particular populations. So I would just be really interested to see how, one, how it actually operates, and then two, is there any study that can be done to see who's affected, demographically? Does it actually do that? Does it actually weed out people? And that's going to be the question. I mean, we know the Supreme Court, said that disparate impact is one way that you can violate the Fair Housing Act. You can have a neutral policy that has a disparate impact on a particular group. Then it's up to the person challenged to demonstrate that it's necessary. And so I think that would be the other big question: is this necessary? If it's having an effect, well, one, is it truly having an effect? People might perceive it's having an effect, but is it? And then if it is having that effect, what's the rationale behind it? Is it something that must be kept? And if not, it could be violative of the law. So we'd have to look at it, and I'm happy to, engage in further discussion about that and look at it.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll actually have staff shoot you a copy of our offer to purchase, because I am interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah.
All right. Is there any plan at NAR to make a more firm recommendation for how to address schools? This is a big one for all of our members, candidly, as you know.
Yeah.
How do we handle this, and what should we be telling people on how to handle it? Because clearly, according to your conversation and what we know, just sending them to greatschools.org, etc., it might not be cutting it.
That's right. And, as someone who oversaw, the federal enforcement of the fair housing laws, I would say it's not true that you can't talk about schools. You can't discriminate, and the question is, how many of us really have accurate and sufficient knowledge about schools to talk about schools accurately? And so the real reason why realtors are advised not to is because you're just giving your impression, and that's how you run into trouble. And so my interest is to find a way to provide more reliable information, whether it be through third-party sources, or to sort of navigate, well, how can realtors more accurately provide school information? It seems like realtors want to talk about it. And that's the challenge. It's almost like, anything else where, if you're finding that laws don't necessarily extinguish the problem, can you mitigate the damage by doing something else? And so all I can say is we're going to roll up our sleeves and make this a major priority. It may take time, right? I mean, this is a big issue, but as I said, it is so tied in with location and with, people's perception of community quality, tax base, everything.
It is. All right. So, please keep us posted on that, because I agree. This is probably one of the biggest landmines I see our members stepping into, frankly,
yeah. And I
over and over again.
Yeah, I welcome ideas on this.
I have some. So after this, we'll connect because I want to make this better. And I came from a rural area growing up outside of Charlotte and then to the urban area, and it's fascinating the discrepancies there too. So we'll
Charlotte
connect.
schools, that's a lot of history there.
Deep history. So good and bad, right? Good, bad, and ugly. Oh, okay, here we go. How can realtors and property managers address and diffuse stigmas that are sometimes attached to HUD housing? This is a great one.
You know, I sort of think some of this is about information and just providing more reliable, accurate information about things, and not sugarcoating and not, denigrating. Also in my last couple of years at HUD, we had a major initiative to try to reform the housing choice voucher program to recognize the ways in which it wasn't serving housing providers well, and some of the factors that have actually even contributed to poorer quality. I don't know where that effort is now, but it was a real genuine effort where we went out and spoke to people in communities nationwide to, one, try to encourage more housing providers to participate in the program. But in order to do so, to figure out what challenges were they facing, and how can we balance the needs of consumers and housing providers. So it was making good headway. I actually am kind of curious, where HUD is on that. But I know Secretary Carson believed very strongly in that, and and a lot of that was to basically take stigma out and create more housing opportunities in areas of higher opportunity as well, to get more landlords participating and to kind of knock away all the pretexts people have and just focus on the economics and the business side.
All right, this is one that's pretty interesting actually, and I think it's broader than just Zillow. So I'll start with the premise of the question, but expound upon it. The question was, when receiving Zillow inquiry applications processed, they're being done by Zillow. Are we required to send a denial letter if we don't select those applications for a rental? But I'll go one further. What are we required to do with all third-party entities that may pre-qualify leads before they come our way? I think that's an interesting thought that I'd never ruminated on. And I don't know if you have either, but what are your thoughts about that? And how do we handle that going forward in a more and more virtual marketplace?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's a fair housing question. I mean, it's a sort of more straightforward business qualification question, right? Or business process question. I would say that's out of my lane. Again, I do believe I have colleagues who could probably help answer that. And if you want to roll that up with the other questions, I'll make sure.
Will do. All right, and I think you have about time for one more. So don't worry, everybody whose questions I didn't answer. Okay, they're still rolling in, so they are not being missed, and we will get them answered. But there is one. Let's see. What's a good? Oh, this is a great one. This is a good one to end on, and you touched on it, but I want to make sure you get to speak on it again. How is NAR addressing diversity at its C-suite level? And what do the demographics currently look like?
Very good. Again, our internal diversity is, our human resources department, and they have been leaders on this well before I arrived. In fact, I learned when I arrived just how much the organization has changed in recent years, both in terms of just overall diversity as well as diversity in leadership positions. Coming from the federal government, I'm very impressed at how diverse NAR is. I don't know that we're there yet. I know internally people celebrate the diversity of NAR. It's governance committees, I think, require greater diversity, but in terms of the actual staff at the association, it's pretty diverse. And I know that people want to do better, but it's talked about, it's championed. I'm very pleased with that. And I also have colleagues, who feel they're heard when they talk about these issues and try to do more. But finally, the governance, among our different committees, I'm a little surprised there. And I think as a membership as a whole, we need to do more about that.
Could not agree more, Bryan.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you. Thank you for staying with us through your technology difficulties.
Yeah, no.
You got to love when tech works and when it fails, right? I always laugh. I'm like, life is so much better with technology, but then when it fails, it's an epic fail, and I have no clue what to do when it's not working. So thank you. Thank you for your time and your guidance. We'll get our questions to you. Thank you for everyone who participated today. Promise we'll get you answers to your questions if we didn't.
And I
hope everyone has a great week. Thanks,
right.
Bryan.
Thank you.
Bye now.